Vaesen was released from Free League Publishing earlier this year. It's been a huge hit for us, and I am so incredibly excited to have this panel today. We've got two of the folks that are most responsible for the line that the Free League has put out. But before we introduce them, let me bring on my co-host for this session. That is the one and only Matthew from the Effect Podcast. Matthew, thanks for joining me.
It's a pleasure to be with you once more here on the Free League channel.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for coming on and being a part of this. I'm going to remind folks that if you are tuning into this and you are a big fan of Vaesen just like we are, feel free to hit that like button down below and, of course, subscribe and comment and all that jazz that we're supposed to say here on YouTube just to grow the channel. And we really appreciate everyone that does. So, without further ado, let's introduce the two guests that we have for this session. The first guest you know as the artist and illustrator of Norse gods, the undead, and his art book was also the inspiration for Vaesen, the role-playing game. That, of course, is Johan Egerkrans. Thank you so much. And then our second guest, absolutely, thank you so much for coming on. And our second guest is an award-winning writer of horror RPGs, and she is also a pop culture lecturer, and she has written probably my favorite scenario for Vaesen that has been released to date, and that is Gabrielle de Bourg. Gabby, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. I'm so excited. Do you want to? I try to do the introduction to kind of give yourself, to let folks know what you do. Do you want to expand upon my introduction at all? You want to let folks know, who you are, what you do?
Well, yeah, sure. Quick. Well, I'm an illustrator and writer. I do books about myths and legends and folklore, like Vaesen and so on. Used to be a concept artist. Now I jumped the fence to becoming more of a children's book author and illustrator. But I also do a lot of books about dinosaurs, which is
I love them.
Pretty good
my greatest love.
I can't seem to find those in English. Are those in English at all?
No, they're not in English yet. But we're working. We're working.
All right.
They're all coming out in German now. So if you speak German.
Oh, okay. Well, maybe I'll have to learn German.
Some other languages, but languages, but not English at the moment. But hopefully, fingers crossed.
Excellent.
Tiny tyrannosaur, fingers crossed.
Gabby, you want to tell folks a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So I call myself a professional nerd because I get to work with a lot of cool nerdy stuff. And one of the biggest things is, of course, as a writer, I mainly write for different RPGs, and I sort of specialize in horror. I've written for Vaesen, I've written for Tales from Loop for Free League before that, and I've also written to a whole bunch of other RPGs, like the Swedish edition of Call of Cthulhu, showing off my elder sign over here.
Nice.
And other fun, like I've also written for the upcoming The Troubleshooters from Helmgast, which is a Franco-Belgian inspired RPG, and I'm going to write another fun thing in English, or actually another few things that are going to be revealed in the coming time. But in general, like I'm spreading my tentacles out to all the horror games that I know.
I love it.
And other than that, I talk about nerdy stuff. Like when I say I'm a pop culture lecturer, I sort of lecture about, like, do you need me to talk about something about horror or like nerd culture in general? I'm usually, at least in Sweden, I'm one of the like go-to names.
So if I was choosing what university to go to and study, where could I come to do pop culture with you as my tutor?
I know.
I've just finished a PhD. I'm not going to go back to university again, but
anytime soon.
Anytime soon.
Exactly. Like currently, we don't have any, but I do visit a lot of like commercial schools, like Bergs in Sweden, and I talk a lot about like the other thing I'm an expert in, which is norm criticism. So it's like, how do you work that into advertising? How do you do that from a media perspective? And I used to do film studies, so That's
excellent. Yeah.
my long background for this. And was a film
We're
lawyer for
both
last
huge
year.
film nerds. We go to the same.
Yeah, yeah.
My daughter's at university
Yes.
right now doing film studies, so
Oh,
Nice.
that's-
I understand that fascination.
So,
So,
Johan,
where do we
I
go
just want to
from
say that I was a big fan of your work even before Vaesen was announced by Free League as an RPG. Like, this is pretty amazing. Like, this is an amazing art book that I have that you've put out here that I've picked up. And so when Free League announced that they were doing an RPG about this work that you've done, I was so excited, right out of the gate, just for this. What inspired you to do this this book about Vaesen? Is it something that like you grew up with? I mean, a lot of times we work into stuff that maybe our parents like introduced us to, and so we kind of carry it on later on in life and expand upon it. What drew you to researching and drawing and illustrating Vaesen?
Well, basically the funny thing is that it almost is a source book, like a role-playing game source book in itself. That's part of the inspiration for the book, the way it's laid out and the way you got sort of articles about each creature. And of course, growing up in Sweden, you grow up with Swedish folklore in books and TV shows, and the grandparents talk about how their parents saw the tomte or vettar or something like that on the farm, or at least a lot of us do. So I mean, just like I think in England, that's that sort of culture. The folklore is still around in a way. I mean, it's sort of diffused a bit since we started moving into the cities, which is one of the main themes of the role-playing game as well. But it's always been there around. I mean, I read John Bauer's books when I was a kid and was fascinated by his art, and that sort of quite apparently had a huge impact on the book. But the other inspiration are the role-playing games books, like the monster manuals for Drakar och Demoner, Dragons and Demons, which is sort of the Swedish equivalent of D&D. So the monster books for those role-playing games I grew up with. And of course, Brian Froud and Alan Lee's Fairies, which came out in 1977, 78, or something like that, I think. Which is a book about British folklore, but so brownies and gnomes and elves and fairies and all that stuff. And I always loved that book. So when I got the chance to do a book of my own that I could write and illustrate on my own, I went to that. I went, what if I did this, but in a Swedish context or a Scandinavian context? That's the sort of main inspirators for the book. So it's John Bauer, Brian Froud, role-playing game supplements, and I always had the idea that it almost should be. When I started playing role-playing games, because when all role-playing games are based on the sort of classic stereotypical Tolkien fantasy world, you use folkloric beings as the creatures, like goblins and so on. And in the Swedish role-playing games, instead of goblins, we called them vettar. So I became interested in where those names came from, and then I started reading up on like the real folklore behind the sort of gamified beings and how they actually sort of worked and what they looked like in folklore. So that's also part of the inspiration. So that came on pretty early age, like 10, 11-ish.
Wow. Okay.
So I've always been interested.
Very cool. Very cool. Gabby, what about you? What is it about horror that draws you to write about it, and why that genre in particular?
A the person that could really answer that. Like, for me, I've always loved horror, and it's always been something that has influenced me a lot. Like, a lot of my favorite movies are horror, and like I always say, there's this long story I tell when people say, "Why do I care so much about horror?" And I tell them about the first time I saw Jaws when I was just 7 years old. It was on TV, and I can still recall that night in perfect memory. I can even tell you, like, the date, I think, was like the 3rd of November, 1997. I actually checked the date it was broadcast because it made such a huge impression on me. And then I had to read everything about the sharks. And then I sort of went, I want to understand why this scared me so much. And the more I start to do that, I watch like the DVD and behind the scenes, and I realize, like, I want to tell stories like this because this has affected me. Like, this is on such a deep emotional plane. And I want to tell that to other people. And I also feel that horror is so interesting as a basis to tell other stories. Like, whenever I do a horror story, like, even if it's horror about something else. Like, there's always something different cooking. Like in Vaesen, my story is very much about like the old nature versus the upcoming industry. And they sort of take that for a horror filter, because the fun thing is then that you can really pull out the extremes, and that can really like add another extra layer of storytelling. And it also allows you to get really creative, because it's just real enough to feel like something you can connect to, but horror is always crazy enough that you can really go far in it.
Sure. Let's Matthew, do you have any other questions that you have any questions that you would like to?
One of my first questions, actually, drawing on all those influences, it strikes me that Vaesen has been very popular in this year. You know, it came out, there've been actual plays all over the internet on it. It seems to have been really popular. Did it surprise you at all, or did you know there was a need for this? Nils calls it cozy horror.
Cozy horror. I love it.
Yeah, no.
Folksy horror.
Yeah.
Not folk horror, it's folksy.
But it seemed to have caught a moment. Is it something to do with 2020, or is it just something that a gap that needed to be filled, do you think?
It's hard to say, but I think I had the same reaction when the book came out.
Really?
It became hugely popular, and we sort of thought it would sell pretty well. I mean, we thought it'd do okay, but it really caught on and spoke to people in a way that I wasn't really prepared for. And it might be the same thing with the role-playing game. That it's might be that it's in its well, this becomes a bit of an Anglicism or a Swedicism, but in its unfreshness, it becomes fresh. If you catch my drift, I think we're in a period when we're sort of looking back. We've sort of done all the classical sort of universal classics, horror tropes and classic monsters, and in all cultures, every country, we're sort of starting to look back at, sort of dig where we stand and look at, okay, but we all know what vampires, like the classic Hollywood vampire, we all know what that's like. But what's the equivalent from the culture we live in? And we try to do stories about that. I mean, you see like Iranian movies about jinn, and you see in all over the world, people are making movies and games about sort of going back to the roots and trying to find our or your one's own take or one's own culture's take on these classic sort of monsters. And I don't know. Yeah. I think that's been going on for a few years now, and I think Vaesen sort of taps into that.
I wonder if it does. And, it's interesting that we've already seen on the Free League Workshop people creating their local folklore, or translating their local folklore into the Vaesen system. The latest one I saw was Mythic Quebec. So Quebecois folklore happening there. But Gabrielle, I also wonder whether there's a moment here, because you obviously picked up on something that I felt very strongly when I first read the Alpha edition, and that is the onslaught of industrialization over rural ways of life. And that was a big thing in my sort of convention scenario I wrote, where I was talking about the coming of the steam train and the collapse of the sea corn economy. I wonder whether in this time, again, in 2020, we're looking back a bit nostalgically at those older ways of life and what we've lost. And I wonder whether we feel that with this weird year that we've had.
Oh, I mean, that's sort of a very interesting analysis. I think that can definitely help to cut back to what I was saying earlier, how horror can make you sort of deal with different things going through in your life. But for me, I think another thing about Vaesen that is really appealing is that it's really like one of the first, but like one of the big proper classic Gothic horror role-playing games. Like, so many of the horror role-playing games we have are often Lovecraft-based, Call of Cthulhu and the slew of games there. And of course, we have like Cthulhu by Gaslight, but it's still very bound to that mythos. Or we have games like Cult or something that goes in a completely different direction. But this really goes back to the roots of like Bram Stokerian Gothic horror. Like when I was writing this and I was listening to Voyage Killar's soundtrack to Bram Stoker's Dracula or Danny Elfman's for the Wolfman, because it really had that very classic Gothic horror feel. But I think that's, again, what makes it fresh is that it takes these classical tropes, but it sort of puts them through this filter, because we're using folklore. Like, we know these stories, but we don't know, and some of us know these creatures, but that makes something new. And again, by adding the whole theme of industrialization and like written during a time when the world was changing, we live in a time when the world is changing, that also becomes applicable to us. And I think it also helps with the fact that how locked in we are, we sort of get into that mindset. Like there's a reason this game puts an emphasis on journeys, because journeys then were big things. It would take days, you had to plan. And suddenly that's our reality again. Like we're back to being locked in. We're back to being isolated. And then a game comes out that really deals with that, but from a different historical time. And it's a great way for us to deal with those emotions, but in a way that's sort of nice and comfortable and isn't hitting too close to home. And also in a nice way kind of allows it to have a happier, not ending necessarily, but, have a happier outcome than what life is doing for us right now.
Sure.
There's always the tendency to go back to, in a time of crisis, people have a tendency to go back to sort of safe things like fairy tales and like classic stories that are not of the moment, that are more, when you're in a crisis, you want to watch Star Wars or Lord of the Rings and not like a documentary about what the world is like. So I think there's that aspect as well, that it is, cozy horror.
Yeah,
in that way. Yeah, it's.
One thing that I'll remind viewers is if you have any questions for Johan or Gabby, let us know in the comments. We'll add them towards the end of the session, and hopefully we can answer any questions that you might have about Vaesen going forward. Johan, my question for you is, of course, we've had Nils on the show previously to talk about how he came up with the rules for Vaesen and for the role-playing game. How involved were you in that development? Was that something that you kind of Nils just kind of go on his own? He just kind of threw stuff, kind of let you take a look at what he was working on and say, hey, what can I do here? Or were you, was it more of a collaborative?
No, it was a collaborative effort with the team on the Free League. We very early on, when the book came out, I think the Free League approached me within a year or something like that after the book came out in 2013. And I think we started having discussions about doing a role-playing game based on the book in 2014 or 2015. So we've been working on it for a long time. So I've been involved in that process all the way. And as an old role player, I had a vision of what it should work like and what it should be like. So I've been in constant contact, but Nils has written the game, definitely. But I always pitched in and came up with ideas, and there was some, I don't like this, could we maybe sort of tweak it a bit more, do it like this, and try to stay, I wanted it to stay as true as possible to the actual folklore, because my book is completely based on folklore. Did a lot of research, and I didn't make up anything. It's all from actual folkloric, what it's called, the technical. They travel around like the Brothers Grimm and collected stories.
Right.
So everything in the book is based on that, and I wanted to retain that genuine feeling as much as possible in the role-playing game as well. So I've been part of the process.
Excellent. Gabby, how did you get involved with writing for Vaesen? Did you? I know you've worked on Tales from the Loop for Free League. They just knew that the horror was kind of your thing, and so they were like, "Hey, would you like to write a scenario or an adventure for us?"
Actually, it was it sort of came from both ways. Like, they have this Swedish podcast called Signaler from Zonen, which is the signals from the zone. And, I would listen to their episodes. And then they did one where they were talking about like how they were developing a horror game. And I was like, wait, Free League's doing a horror game? I got to get involved with this. And this was just before the Swedish con called Gothcon. Which is like our biggest role-playing / tabletop game con. So I had heard the episode, and all the different publishers are there, so I will always stick around and chat a lot with them. And they were there, so I was like, also, I gotta ask you, like, you were talking about a horror game in the last podcast, and then Nils said, yes, we were going to talk to you about that. Because and then they told me what it was about, and they told me they were going to do Vaesen, which was, that was great fun. And they sort of told me the pitch, and I got so excited when I heard the whole pitch for the game. I was like, yes, this is a perfect game. I'm so missing this type of horror game. And they would also like send me, and then after that, it was sort of like set in stone. Like, yeah, we'll get in touch with me more. So I got to see some of the early rules when Nils was writing it, just sort of get an idea what the game was about. And like when Johan and I would meet, I would ask him how it was going, because it was one of those projects where I was super excited to write for it, but I was just generally excited for it because it was so much a kind of project that appeals to me. But that was how I became involved. And then when I got like, now it's sort of time for us to put things together, could throw us a pitch and start writing, when the rulebook was sort of finished, or at least like there were other mysteries as well to have a look at, it always helps a lot.
Let's go to the first question in the chat. Jojo in Space asks, question for Johan and Gabrielle both. Do you have a favorite Vaesen?
Yes. Yeah, it's my standard answer though. But yeah, my favorite Vaesen is Night Raven, Notre Dame, because I like ravens and I like ghosts, and it's a ghost raven. So what's not to like?
One thing, while doing the research for this panel, I realized that you illustrated a book for Osprey Games that is Odin's Ravens, which I had.
It's a game. Yeah. I did some stuff for them a few years ago.
Yeah, that was interesting.
So I did Odin's game. Odin's Ravens. I actually did that at the same time as I did Norse Gods. So it was a bit of cross-pollination between the two
Oh, nice.
projects. It was really strange, sort of working on them both. But no, it's really cool. And the most fun I had actually with they did a tabletop miniatures game called Rogue Stars, which is sort of scum and villainy in a sort of world that's rather similar to a big science fiction property. But it was so much fun to do because I only draw fantasy stuff these days, and sort of Vaesen is still basically fantasy in a way, but sort of old-timey genre stuff. And it was so much fun drawing spaceships and robots and ray guns and weird aliens. So I got to do that at some point. I got to take a break from undead and dragons and stuff and do some science fiction thing.
Gabby, Gabby,
but that's my favorite Vaesen anyway.
That's your favorite? Yeah, sure. Gabby, you have a favorite Vaesen?
I mean, of course, I gotta answer. Like, I love the Grimm for obvious reasons.
Sure.
And like because I also love the whole like exactly, which is named after the mystery we can see.
Yes.
They did change it though. It was originally called the Grimm Secret, and I thought my pun was great.
I see. Yes.
Nice.
But you know, I really like the Grimm, but I'm also a huge fan of Draugs. I find them to be very, very interesting, and I've always been a sucker for everything that involves ghosts and different types of ghosts. And like, I'm not sure how much of a Swedish Vaesen it is, but a personal favorite type is the classic white lady that will haunt like manors and castles and halls.
They're in Sweden as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually had like a local castle where I grew up where we had a classic white lady legend, and that was always really fun to sort of like walk around and, you know, see if you could spot any evidence of her.
I feel a cold presence.
Exactly.
Daniel asks, I'm wondering if Näcken is a Swedish Vaesen or if he is found in other Nordic countries.
He's found in other Nordic countries. He's he's found in Norway, and I think a similar creature is found in Finland as well. But I think it's called the neck in Norway. But there's similar creatures in and I think the British water fairy in Nixie, that's the same etymology behind the name, so they're related. And I mean, of course, the sort of a version of Näcken is the Becka Hest, the brook horse, and that's the same creature as a kelpie, basically. But in Swedish folklore, it's often sort of suggested that that the horse is Näcken in sort of in horse guise, or whatever you call it, but that it takes the form of a horse sometimes. But it's very similar to the kelpie. So yeah, it's and I think there's similar creatures in other countries, but they're usually females, so like the Rusalka in Slavic folklore and so on. But what the creatures that want to drown you are pretty frequent in all mythologies for some reason. Perhaps because people drown in every culture. So I mean, the kappa is a great example. It's very sort of neckish in a way in Japanese folklore, though it's a bit more stupid.
I must admit, one of my favorites out of your book that didn't get into the game was the I'm going to struggle to say this in Swedish, so I'm going to say it in English and save everybody the embarrassment. The lake wife, as it were. And I was really disappointed when I got the alpha of the rules, and she wasn't in there. She wasn't in there at all.
No, I guess, but she's basically the same as Skogsrå, the forest maiden or forest wife, wood wife.
Yes.
Only she lives in lakes
adventure.
instead of a forest. But then apart from that, she's very similar. So
Yeah.
apart from her lake cows that she keeps trap.
I love those lake cows.
Getting into the nitty gritty now. But
What do you think the future of Vaesen is from your point of
Curse
view? Are you
of
gonna
the
be writing
lake
more
cow.
adventures?
Sorry.
What are we going to see any new books coming out for Vaesen? And are you going to be illustrating them? And are you going to be writing them, Gabby? Have we got any plans that you can tell us about?
We have plans, but I'm not sure what I can talk about. But
Okay.
we're expanding the world, I think.
I will say that we had Thomas on last week for the Free League update, and he kind of teases a little bit about the future of the Vaesen line in that. So if folks are interested in what he was able to at least make public, feel free to turn into that. But yeah, I don't know if there's a whole lot of stuff that's public.
But I will be part of it. I will be illustrating an upcoming source book or volume or whatever, whatever you call it. So definitely, yeah, there's more stuff coming on.
Gabby, are you involved in any of the future plans?
Nothing that I've heard of so far, but if you want to, like, I'll say, like I always say, like, if you want me to see me write more, let people know. And but in most cases, it's more usually it's more a case of like products have to sort of be further along before I sort of know when I'm getting involved, so that they know what's going to happen, and then I know that let's get you involved. But I love to write more for Vaesen. It's a terrific game and a really fun universe, and very much sort of up my alley, genre-wise.
And Johan's got a whole book on vampires, for example, which I'm sure would slot right in.
Yeah, they might find a way into something. We'll see. But no, I mean this, like we said, like you said, people are sort of porting it to their folklore, and I think that's the cool thing about it. That's the interesting thing about Vaesen or fairies or these supernatural creatures, the invisible people, that they are everywhere. That was the interesting thing when I did the undead, that the undead in every culture are so similar. The same concepts popping up over and over again throughout time, beyond time and space, so to speak. But there's sort of universal concepts. So I mean, you have Aboriginal revenants in Australia that are really similar to like a gust in Sweden, which is so cool. I mean, they've been isolated for like 60,000 years or something like that, and it's still the same because it's part of humanity to be afraid of these things and think about these things, that nature has a soul and that some sort of entity that are neither God nor man, neither God nor man. But that there are entities in our world that sort of controls our destinies and controls nature and controls that nature itself has an agency, and it's sort of represented by these creatures. And it's really interesting. So it's really easy to sort of just port it to the local.
And I think that's also that's a very nice mirroring of what happened with the Tales from Loop, where a lot of people would like port it to play in their hometowns and where they grew up, because such an important aspect of that game is being a kid and being around where I grew up. And like that was one of the reasons I love Tales from Loop so much, is I'm from Mälaröarna. Like it was my backyard too. Though technically I'm more things from the flood time because I was born in 1990, but it's still very much like I would look at Simon's pictures or things and just like, I recognize it. And me and Simon have often talked about like very specific local trends that would happen at Mälaröarna. And like that, and that's what I think is, it's really fun to see people doing this porting for Vaesen as well, because it really captured the spirit of the game, because for me and Johan, these Vaesen are second nature to us. Like, we grew up caring about them in our folklore. So people taking their folklore really, like, it really adds a very important part of that culture that we take for granted.
Let's get to a few more of the questions here. Graham asks, actually, this has been asked a couple times, and we might as well just ask it. Hi, Johan. Will the art books be released for English on the Free League website in the future?
I don't know, but you can buy them. I think nowadays you can buy them through. We have Amazon in Sweden now.
Right.
Finally. Well, whatever, we have them now. So you can buy them from Amazon.
Excellent.
The Swedish, the English books are Swedish English editions. There's not a British or American edition of Vaesen, but they are. I mean, they're translated into English, so they're available in both Swedish and English, and you can buy them on Amazon or through Grimfrost, which is sort of Viking stuff page that also carries my book.
And I bought mine from a Swedish outlet called Bookhouse, which
Bookus,
is very cheap shipping. It was,
if you're in Europe, you
80
can
krona shipping.
Yeah, if you're in Europe, you can order them through Bookus. But if you're in the States, or I mean, in Australia or South America or whatever. I mean, if you're somewhere else, Amazon or Grimfrost is perhaps the best choice. But you should be able to order them wherever you are.
See here, we've got a comment that says, we need a nice Vaesen campaign. Please, 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 please. Gabby, I think you got some writing to do.
Yeah, I'll get right on it.
That is one of the things that I think makes Vaesen unique among the horror RPG genre. Is it really tends towards a campaign and towards character role playing. Quite apart from the horror that's going on around you, actually, people really seem to love developing their characters. Every game I run overruns because everybody's having a little conversation that has nothing at all to do with the storyline, but is building up these people's relationships and characters. It's great to watch as a GM, but sometimes I'm thinking, I need to push it on. But yeah, campaign would be lovely.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think no, sorry.
No, and I think that that's one of the charms. Like, that's why I just added a whole you can stop at a what's it called? Vaesens. So you can you can stop at an inn for beer or something, and just have the classic villagers being scared of where you're going, because it's the sort of game where stay out of that
near the castle.
Exactly, because it's the kind of game where you really want that. It's it's just fun interacting with the world, and that is so true. It's so much of a charm. The first time I ran Wicked Secret, we overran a bit just so that we sort of would get anywhere in the plot and the clues, because we had so much fun just doing everything else.
Yeah, it really is sort of the Hammer film version of Scandinavia. Yeah.
It is.
That's what we aim for. I mean, it's really that sort of classic. Everybody. The characters walk into the tavern, and everyone's sitting there with beer mugs and beards. And now I started thinking about Eddie Izzard's sketch when he talks about Dracula. Don't go to Castle Dracula. Get filmed if you go to Castle Dracula.
Matthew, do you have any more questions for our panelists?
No, I'm seeing some great comments. I just wonder whether we should point at some of those.
Sure.
Yeah, better those than the crap comments.
Let's see here. A superstitious world is a dangerous world. Let's see here. Okay, here we go. Gabrielle, how often do you add friends and family into your scenarios and games? I mean, family and friends as NPCs. That's a good question.
Oh, have I been busted?
Yeah, have you?
I think Orvar the Seaman is.
Exactly.
I'm
But
treading
I'm
fields,
innocent
actually.
of that one. So but I mean, some of them I do. I've actually put myself in them, or like one of them is not directly myself. We just ended up having a lot of similarities. So, which is in Tales from Loop. The girl Ellen at the video store was more a case of like, oh crap, that's basically me. But especially when I wrote a speech edition of Call of Cthulhu, I put in a lot of friends and family, just because I had to create this society of members, and I was like, how do I just create a whole bunch of people out of thin air? So and like whenever you write, it's impossible not to be inspired. Like you are automatically inspired by the world around you. Like you cannot help that. You hear names or looks or traits or something. So I asked my original Call of Cthulhu and like role-playing game, I was like, do you guys want to become Call of Cthulhu NPCs, or at least like inspire them? So like usually I borrowed names and a few traits, which was real fun. And I actually put myself and my sister in that mostly just because I wanted to give my character the goriest death of them all. Because if you're writing horror and you're not like giving people very gory deaths, like you're doing something wrong. But there's like in a few other games there are a few people here and there, and mostly it's more the case of like occasionally when I've been inspired by someone, it's easier to just get in touch with them and be like, okay, like instead of like trying to file the serial numbers off, I'll talk to them like, hey, I want to borrow this thing, like your name or this part of the trait, or like just even a picture to send to our illustrator because it's good. Do you want something in return? Like, do you want to name a character, or do you want to throw in something else? Because it really like helps cut out time, and people think it's kind of fun. And so far, nobody has really gone like, why would you do that? Because we do. And I've also
horrible
done
things as their NPCs, or are they not the evil ones?
No, usually not the evil ones. There's one evil one in one game, which is more like based on a person I dislike, whose traits I borrowed, but everything else is
Without
not
asking
at all.
permission.
No, which is incredibly dissimilar. So I sort of went like, if this person would figure out who this is, it's like
The village drunk.
Yeah, exactly. But that is like the one time. Otherwise, they tend to end up like being good-ish characters. But you know, if it's like very good friends, I'll also throw in sort of fun like traits that throw a bit of shade, but in a sort of like humorous thing. Like there's one NPC in Call of Cthulhu who's like a really sore loser and winner from one of my other friends, which he thought was fun. Or so you know, I'll throw in the good and the bad habits, because now people are like, no person is just good or bad. Like we have different sides, and that's an easy way to add a bit of depth to it. And I mean, there's also reference to Free League in A Wicked Secret, which was sort of like they were selling in their podcast how they wanted to do a cameo, and it was hard to fit them in, but I realized like, yeah, I can fit the name in. It would actually work out really well. So
I'm gonna have to look at that again now to see if I can spot them.
So it's not them, but it's just the name itself.
Yes.
William asks, will the Vaesen rules compendium be up on Roll20 and when? I know previously Thomas has been on, I think he was on the first Free League update that we did. He was talking about how they were developing those for Roll20. I think that's the next game that they plan on releasing on Roll20, but as far as when, I am not quite sure. I don't know if anybody else here knows, but I know that they're trying to get that out as quickly as possible, because that's a big part of how role-playing is happening during this time in the world. So let's see here. Joel asks, do you consider Vaesen NPC stats as important in horror games? Personally, I see the descriptions and motivations as more important in horror games.
Yeah, that was a thing we talked a lot about when we developed the game. That you shouldn't have. That's the beautiful thing about the engine, the game engine. the year zero game engine, that you only have stats for the characters. Basically, you only have stats for the player characters, and you roll against the world. And that was really important for us not to have, because I really wanted to keep the Vaesen mystical, and in contrast to other games where you have like the what they call the gods and demigods manual or whatever it's called in Dungeons and Dragons, where you can sort of look up Cthulhu or Thor or Brahman or any god basically that humanity has ever come up with, except for God. You can look up. You can't look up sort of the stats for Jesus, but which would be, but you can look up the stats for sorry everyone, but it would be cool. But you can look up the stats for Thor, and you can look up the stats for Cthulhu and whatever, and as well as in Cthulhu. Call of Cthulhu, you can do that as well. You have like, okay, he's got 800 million hit points, but he's still got 800 million hit points. You could possibly kill him, and it's sort of defined, and that it lessens them in a way. It becomes them. It makes them more vulnerable in a way, and it makes them. Yeah, less mystical. It demystifies them, and we didn't want to do that with Vaesen. So the NPCs, the Vaesen doesn't have stats. Not in that. They have like abilities, but you don't defeat them by cutting the heads off with a sword or whacking them in the face. I mean, you have to do a ritual. You have to do. There's more like a mystery to solve to defeat the Vaesen. So, and I think that's a really interesting way of doing it. It's never about just physical force or combat. That's not how you win a game. You can sort of hold them off that way, but it's like in Supernatural. You have to find the body and burn it. But you can fight the ghost with an iron bar or with salt or whatever, or a shotgun, and sort of hold them off. But you can never defeat them that way. You have to sort of. You have to solve the mystery to succeed. So that's very much a part of that's sort of integral to the whole game system and the whole idea of the game, that you don't have stats for them. Sorry, I've been rambling that.
No, that's it. Good.
No, I agree with all of that. Like the first thing I write is always the descriptions and motivations and characters, and like stats is like the last thing I always do. Like it's the absolute last thing I do, and in some games I haven't even had to do them because the publisher would be like, "Oh no, you don't have to do them. We'll handle that if you don't. If you want to focus on it." Yeah, exactly. Because sometimes they know, especially if it's a game that's not out, that you're not incredibly like familiar with. It's even easier because then they have a lot of knowledge of that engine, and I don't, and it's just super quick for them to do. Vaesen, I did do the stats though, because it's a year zero game, and I'm really familiar with year zero. But that was a very quick process. But it was all about like just like descriptions, motivations, and also trying to make descriptions that are just like physically different between people. Like if you look at A Wicked Secret, you'll notice that like every character has a different hair color, and every hair color is very distinct. Or like the two that are related have very strong red hair color. That's just a way for us to easily know who they are and to like not mix up people. And I even got a very valid criticism that I ended up using the name Ström a bit much because we have like a few characters with their name ending in that, and that became a bit confusing for like a game group, and that made sense to me. Like it's just down to that level. Like sometimes you have to be that specific of how do we keep these characters apart so that players really know them. And of course, everybody should be well defined. Like they would say like when you're running a character, and no matter the game, but especially in horror, because it's usually more about interaction, like you need to pick out one or two traits that are so simple, you describe them in a line and that makes people know, like, I know this person because of trait. So in Vaesen, it's like, oh yeah, Karlström, she owns a sawmill and is like the village head or the quit. They own the most forest and they have very strong fiery red hair, which matches their personalities.
Excellent. So one last question I have for you, Gabby, is we have Matthew's coming on tomorrow to run your scenario, the Wicked Secret. Are there any tips you'd like to give him before he brings this scenario to his players on the show?
My first tip is make Karlström very like fun, sweet, and charismatic. That always ends up being fun. Like all of you are going to run this. Turn off like your headphones for a second. But when I played my group, one of the characters started flirting with her, and they ended up having like a mini relationship, and that made their reveals even better. So that's one thing. Like make her very charismatic, which she is, and like a very good host. Make the players like her. That really helps. And the other thing is like also make her rivalry with Quit very obvious. And of course, like keep the motivations of the Grim itself very sort of undefined until you sort of learn it. And like keep in mind that it isn't human. Like it has its own thing and is very bound to that church. And just remember how much it wants to protect it.
I'm excited about in this adventure is you've got a lot of clues, actual handout clues, which is a little bit difficult to do online, but Doug, you and I will sort it out, don't worry.
We'll figure it out.
Fax machine.
Yeah. There you go.
It's going to be, I've got to do this in 4 hours, and this is a really interesting one because it's so of a piece. It's with some of the other ones you can kind of, I'll chop out that bit of the story that's a kind of satellite to the main story. But this, it all happens in kind of one place and with quite a close-knit community. So that's where I'm having just a little bit of difficulty of cutting stuff out. But I'll get through it. Don't worry. I'm quite looking forward to doing this.
That's really fun to hear. And it's really structure of what I call like the isolated sandbox, which is like you do like a sandbox because sandbox scenarios are driven more by character and character motivations and backstory and having to tie those together. They're great for mysteries. And by that, I mean like mystery-based adventures. But it's also like very isolated because it means like you really like you're not going to get out of here until you solve the mystery. So like isolated sandboxes is every Hercule Poirot story you've ever read.
Yeah.
Like Murder on the Orient Express, like if you were to do that as an RPG scenario, that is the exact definition of what I would call like an isolated sandbox, because it's structured around like just talking to people and sort of finding out what's going on. It's not very linear in its progression once you're there. Which is also why it's going to be
for the train.
Exactly, except for the train. But like from there, it's stuck, and you can say like it's not going to get unstuck until a certain point, like until this point, which is either like a deadline or it's like it's going to get unstuck once you solve it because it's certain agreement we have as players that we accept these things.
Yeah,
it will be unstuck when dramatically convenient.
Well, I think the timing in this adventure is going to be when it's dramatically significant, rather than following necessarily the strict timing.
And you have a great timing device as well, which is the church bells. Like
yes,
I always like whenever you throw in the church bells, that's a great way to sort of add tension to it.
I almost wanted to bring a handbell so that I could ring it somewhat off screen.
That's a very good idea. I've actually been following a player who's running it, and it's really fun because it's written as a diary from like first person perspective of one of the characters. So it's really close to like reading Dracula, which is written in diary form. And it really like adds a whole another level of like authenticity to the game world. Like it really makes you understand like, oh yeah, this is how it's all playing out, and it's super fun to follow. It's unfortunately in Swedish, otherwise I would recommend to anyone. But if you're Swedish, check out Arilds dagbok on rollspel.nu. It is worth your read because it's incredibly well written too.
Excellent.
All right. Well, we're running out of time. I just want to let's if folks want to know more about your work, Johan, where should they go?
Well, they should go to. I got a Facebook account, like everyone. I got a public Facebook account. Johan Egerkrans Illustrator, and it's the same on Instagram, so you can find me there as well. You can find my books, at Free League, obviously, and then on Greenfrost and Amazon, as I said, and Bocus or Adlibris if you're in Europe or Sweden. You can perhaps put up links later on.
Good. I sure
Also got a web shop now.
okay.
Yeah. So it's Johan Egerkrans at Shopify.
Okay.
Just Google Shopify and Johan Egerkrans, you probably get there. I don't have the address in my head yet.
It's all right.
But so that's going on as well.
Very good.
Yeah, I guess that's it.
Okay. Gabby, if folks want to know more about you and all the stuff that you're doing, where should they go?
I have an Instagram that's at Gabrielle de Bourg. And then I also have a Facebook page at Gabrielle de Bourg Writer, or just Gabrielle de Bourg Writer. And other than that, I have a homepage, which is gabrielledebourg.com, where I update all my things. You can keep track of me.
Excellent. Very good. Very good. I want to remind folks that if you would like to, if you haven't subscribed to the Effect podcast with my co-host Matthew here, you should definitely check that out. They do excellent podcasts, actual plays, and all sorts of free league content that they've got. You've got two podcast feeds that you're supplying on a regular basis.
Yeah,
too.
on effectpodcast.org, we have every 3 weeks we have our Talk magazine show, and every week, pretty much, I think, since it started on effectap.org, we have episodes of actual plays. Currently running Destroyer of Worlds, Free League's great alien adventure.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, I want to thank my guests for coming on and giving their time. Thank you so much. Your time is our greatest asset, and I appreciate that you gave yours for us today. And I want to thank everyone that tuned in. I'll remind folks that if you enjoyed this session, please hit that like button down below. And if you have not subscribed to this channel, please do so. We really appreciate everyone that is part of our YouTube community, and we just want to create more and more content for you because we really appreciate everyone that embraces everything that we do here at Free League Publishing. All right, that's going to do it for this session. We'll see you tomorrow with an actual play of A Wicked Secret brought to you by the Effect Podcast and our one and only Matthew. We'll see you then. Bye now.